All right, then I would suggest that we start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this issue of the LPA Cap Talk series on the IBOR transition. After many years of preparation, 2021 is the critical year for firms to complete their transition away from LIBOR. The LIBOR administrator, ICE benchmark administration, is consulting on ceasing publications of all LIBOR settings, with the exception of most US dollar LIBOR terms at the end of this year, leaving less than a year to remove the remaining reliance on these benchmarks. The consultation results on proposed end dates for LIBOR has now closed, while the cessation announcement is awaited. And the question you have to ask yourself is, are you ready for life without LIBOR from end 2021? And to help you answer that question, we spent the next 60 minutes on discussing the transition management. Can we go to the next slide, please? LPA is one of the leading cap tech companies since it was founded in 1999. We are a global, rapidly growing provider who transforms and digitizes players in the ecosystem of capital markets, and that is from banks and insurers to asset managers. Our expertise is founded in our sound capital markets knowledge combined with powerful technology. And within the IBOR transition, we are one of the leading services provider since the first days. Today we have and still do deliver projects and insights worldwide on the IBOR transition. We produce articles, opinions, we engage in thought leadership for our clients and in industry conferences, and produce software to tackle all the various challenges being entangled with the transition. Next slide, please. Besides myself, Maximilian Beckmann, I'm happy to have Sabine and Stefan with me today. Hi Sabine, hi Stefan, good to have you on board. And together, the three of us are heavily involved in LPA's IBOR transition practice, and we're currently working with clients on various aspects of the transition. Before we start, I would like to shortly highlight today's agenda. We will spend roughly 40 to 45 minutes on the presentation, and that leaves 15 minutes for a Q&A session at the end. Regarding the presentation, first we will speak about overall transition management and then focus more on transitioning the client business. You will not be able to ask questions verbally, so somewhere on your screen you should find a Q&A icon, and there you can post questions. I will collect the questions, sort them, and try to address all of your questions in the respective Q&A session. All right, then I would suggest that we start. So just before we make a deep dive into the client business, Stefan, could you please give us a short overview on the current timeline for LIBOR cessation, please?
Yes, Max, happy to do that. As you mentioned before, the year 2021 will be the most challenging year within the LIBOR transition. And as you already said, actually we are in a phase where everybody's waiting on the announcement following the IBOR consultation for a cessation of LIBOR, and we are waiting whether there will be a cessation or a non-representative announcement for each of these LIBORs. Nevertheless, what kind of announcement that will be? The effect will be that the ISDA fallback spread will be locked in, and that is maybe the starting point for the transition. So the ISDA spread is known from that point on, and the cessation effective date is also known. And from that point on, if you're looking at the recommendations of the national working groups, for example, the Sterling working group, then you have 6 to 8 months left until the end of Q3 to complete the active transition of your legacy LIBOR business. And after you have complete that active transition, there will be the CCP switches, especially for LIBOR to RFR, which if we have a look at the current consultation of LCH, might be in November that year. And then the cessation effective date for LIBOR and also for Ionia will be at the end of that year. So at the 31st December 2021 will be the last day probably where LIBOR is quoted based on the current methodology. That is true for Sterling LIBOR, Swiss franc LIBOR, Japanese yen, and Euro LIBOR, but not for US dollar LIBOR. There might be one additional 18 months, especially for the most important tenors. And it is planned that US dollar LIBOR will be ceased at June 2023. So this is probably all the relevant or the most relevant milestones in that year. And the challenges you are faced as market participants within that transition.
Perfect. Then over to you, Sabine. Could you please give us some thoughts how our today's topic is related to the overall context of the IBOR transition? Sabine, I think you might still be muted.
Sorry, some technical issues. My mute button
perfect.
Was gone. So, yes, Max, thank you. Happy to jump in. Sorry for the disturbance. Yes, when we look at the transition, we can either look at various categories of products or at our client or counterparty structure. So, of course, you have to distinguish in your transition if you have a loan, if you have derivatives, securities and bonds are somehow treated differently, especially as you will then need multilateral negotiations. So we won't focus on this topic. And there might be accounts with a short maturity, which can also be linked to a LIBOR rate, but mainly the highest issues we face in the loans and in the derivatives departments, and especially if those two can, of course, also be linked. So when we now look at the clients, we can either look at our professional counterparties, which are banks in the interbank market, or at least within the financial services industry, or at our core client business. And I think we can talk a lot about both sides, especially, for example, focusing on the CCP transition with the derivatives in the interbank market. But focus of today's transition is the client. So how do we have to treat our client? How do we have to approach our clients? What is the focus? What are the risks? What are the tasks? And as we try to tackle only the most important parts, we want to focus on loans and derivatives for the time being of our seminar today.
Okay, understood. But maybe you can elaborate a bit more what is so special regarding the client business in comparison to the other players you've mentioned.
Yes, of course. Can you switch the slides, please? So when we talk about clients, the most important thing is conduct risk. I think conduct risk is essential in the treatment of the client, and it is probably the highest risk you're facing during the LIBOR transition. Conduct risk is especially important, for example, for the FCA, which announced some couple of years ago that all firms must be able to show consistently that the fair treatment of their clients is at the heart of their business model. And during all discussions regarding the LIBOR transition, they only repeated this and focused on that topic. So fair client treatment and conduct risk is really the most important thing. And when we talk about conduct risk, that of course relates to our client business. We can then see where do we find conduct risk and why do we have to tackle it. I think on a high level view, and we will probably see more of that in the coming slides, but conduct risk affects various areas during the transition. Namely, first and foremost, conduct risk has to be considered in the entire planning process, and you need dedicated responsibilities. So it's not just something you document in the end, but you have to keep conduct risk and the fair client treatment in mind from the beginning of your transition project and from the beginning of your planning. And when we then come to client communication, which is quite clear that client communication is key to a fair client treatment. The prerequisite for that is a good staff training, because your staff has to talk with the clients and everyone has to be able to communicate clearly and in line with your strategy, and everyone has to be able to understand how the client is affected and what the bank offers to facilitate this transition for the client. And finally, the last part, as usual, an effective control system is required during the transition to address both conduct risk and operational risks. And finally, a good audit trail where you document what you are doing and how you do it and what you discuss with your clients, so that future audits, external or internal, can then be easier for you, that you can prove what you did and that you really did everything to the best interest of your client.
Sounds like there is a lot to be taken into consideration. So Stefan, could you please give us an idea for the necessary milestones within the upcoming transition?
Yes, for sure. I think a lot of points we just mentioned before in the overall timeline. But if we are especially focusing on all milestones in that year, which is relevant for the transition of your client business, then there are some more milestones you have to have a look at. And we draft that timeline exemplified for sterling LIBOR. And therefore, for sterling LIBOR, the UK working group mentioned in the last year that you should be operationally ready for SONIA lending until Q4 2020. So every bank now should be operationally ready to offer SONIA lending products for their client base. And the next milestone after the announcement we mentioned before from IBOR or the FCA for the end of LIBOR will be the end of Q1. That milestone is set from the Sterling Working Group that from that point on there should be, or they recommend that there should be no new LIBOR-based lending or interest rate swaps except for risk management purposes. So you as a bank should be prepared, therefore, that from Q2 on there might be no GBP LIBOR-based lending in the market, and that every lending you offer to your customer might be SONIA lending from Q2 on. And after that, the next most important milestone is the mentioned before complete active transition milestone at the end of Q3. So after the announcement of the end of LIBOR, which might be a kickstart for your transition program with the client, there are from then on 6 to 8 months you have to talk to all your clients with IBOR related or LIBOR related products, and to negotiate these deals with your clients to change them to deals where LIBOR hasn't any more effect to that contract. And to do that, it is important that you know in which contract you have a link to direct, or may it be an indirect link to LIBOR, and that portfolio screening should be completed at the end of Q1 if you have a look at the recommendation of the Sterling Working Group. And yeah, the last part then will be the end of sterling LIBOR as we know it today at the end of the year. But from a transition perspective, the most interesting part, or the most challenging part, the negotiations with the client and the change of existing legacy contracts should be completed until the end of Q3 of that year. So, Sabine, do you have any points to add? Have I forgotten something?
Yes, two more thoughts perhaps. Stefan, you said, well, the active transaction should be completed within Q3, but this is only the end of the process. We can also talk about when do we have to start the process, and not from a technical point of view, where I guess everyone will have started, but from a communicational point of view. So when it comes to the communication, again, there is no regulation on that. No one has a concrete regulation where you have to start and where you have to be finished, but we have certain guidance from the working groups. And the Swiss working group, or the FINMA, is not the working group, the FINMA announced certain guidelines when they expect a client outreach, and they did not limit this to the Swiss francs, but to all LIBORs and all currencies and all legislations. So they expect that the first client outreach should be started by the end of Q1, based on a complete screening of the portfolio. So in the next couple of weeks, every bank should be able to have a good insight where they have products which are linked to LIBOR in whatever way, and then reach out to the client, because the client communication can be a multi-step approach. So you will probably have to communicate in several iterations with the client, and that's why they recommend that you start the communication so early in comparison to when you have to be finished. And a final thought on the timeline is, one might ask, well, that's all fine. We have to translate, we have to change our contracts, we have to communicate with our clients, all good. But what happens if we cannot change our products? What happens if we are technically or for whatever reason not able to adapt it? What happens by the end of the year if there is no LIBOR left? And this situation is called a tough legacy, and we expect a consultation on this topic during probably Q2, with certain ways to handle that issue, whereas probably a synthetic LIBOR at least in certain currencies, so that not for new products, not for new trades with our clients, but for contracts where you are not, or you as a bank are not able to change it to the new risk-free rate world, how to deal with this.
And Stefan, what are, from your point of view, the challenges when you talk to your clients to transition existing deals?
I think one big challenge is the current market environment in several currencies. For example, sterling or US dollar. We have put here some figures for the sterling market. Because if we think about how the fallback approach is designed, especially within ISTA, or also recommended from the ARC for loans, that is the historical spread approach. And if we have a look at the history of the tenor basis between LIBOR and the RFRs, then we see that in the current market phase, these basis is very low compared to the history, which means that the ISTA spread adjustment, which is an historical median of the last 5 years of that spread, is actually for sterling LIBOR, 3-month sterling LIBOR, 12.1 basis point. But the real spread for traded in the market for 3 months LIBOR currently is something nearly about 0. So the 3 months GBP LIBOR actually is 3.5 basis points, and the SONIA, if we are looking at a compounded 3 months OAS swap, will be something about 5 basis points. So this basis is actually nearly negative, or is negative. And if you now go to your client and say to him, okay, you are actually paying just 3 months GBP LIBOR, which is about 3.5 basis points. And we want to change that to SONIA, where when he looks on the screen, the current SONIA fixing, overnight fixing, is something about 5 basis points. Then he might say, okay, why should I change to an interest rate which is actually higher than the interest rate in my contract? And when you then have to explain to him that you also want to have a spread on top of that new interest rate benchmark, that it is economically fair, then that might be some difficult discussions with your clients you are faced in the current market phase. So, Sabine, what are your thoughts here? Do you have anything to add?
Yes, just some small thoughts. I think it is quite clear that the discussion will definitely be difficult, or you in any case will have to do some explanations with your client, but you should have, or you should keep in mind that this is a pure effect on the cash flows. And what you cannot forget is you see this now, but the effect will sort of nibble out over the time. And as soon as there is no LIBOR available anymore, you cannot see the difference anymore, because, well, there's no LIBOR, so you don't have that reference. So you see this at a certain point in time, and the closer you get to the cessation, and especially after the cessation, no one will see it anymore. So that is something you have to discuss and explain, but it's probably nothing that your client will come up with over the next couple of years and discuss it again and again with you, because this difference is not longer visible as the reference LIBOR is not available anymore.
Yeah, I think one important point here is that the client has to understand that he has to look on the whole deal over the whole maturity, and that what we see before is just a cash flow effect at the beginning, but the change should, and that's what I understood from your explanation of conduct risk and treating customers fairly. The change should be fair in the sense of a value neutrality. So the change should be value neutral over the whole period. And if we are then looking at the market and these market mechanisms, then we see that actually the spread is nearly 0 basis points for example, also for a 1-year basis swap between SONIA and 3 months GBP LIBOR, but the traded basis increases with the maturity and converge against the ISDA spread adjustment. And that's something, so the ISDA spread adjustment or the ISDA fallback framework is, from my point of view, clearly a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's also what, for example, the Sterling Working Group also analyzed in their paper to credit adjustment spreads. And that's also what we now see in the sterling market. So if we are looking not on the current basis, and or we are looking on the traded basis, for example, on forward starting basis swaps beginning in 1 year, so probably after the cessation of sterling LIBOR, then we see that these forward starting basis swaps, and that's the graph on top, the blue line, nearly trading on the ISDA spread adjustment, which is there as a gray line. So there is nearly no difference between the ISDA spread adjustment and the forwards of traded in the market for that tenor basis between LIBOR and SONIA. And therefore, from a value neutral or a value perspective, a change which might look a bit crucial for the client if you're just looking at the cash flows at the front will be value neutral over time. And that's something which might be a difficult point to understand and which you have to explain to your client so that he understands that that approach, that historical median approach, is from a value perspective a fair point. And what are also important to mention is, from a bank risk perspective, if we are just changing the view a bit and we think about how can we manage the risks in LIBORs, then we should mention that the CCP transition will be earlier than the LIBOR cessation. And what we see here, these products you might use to manage these basis risk you are faced in the transition won't exist after the CCP transition. So there is a time where maybe there is a LIBOR fixing and you might also have LIBOR trades with your customers, which might be change the interest benchmark after cessation, but you're not able to manage that risks with basis swap at the market. That's something you have to keep in mind here.
But what is the correct spread from a conduct risk perspective? Maybe Sabine, you can take that question.
Yes, sure. Stefan already mentioned that keyword value neutral. So when we talk about correct, we have to ask ourselves, well, treat your client fairly. What is fair? I mean, fair is quite an abstract word. So how can we translate that into measures where we can judge the correctness of a certain approach? Just to sum it up quickly, why do we need that spread? Well, we need to have an economic translation from the LIBOR to the risk-free rate or alternative reference rate, as they have a different risk profile. And we do this via a credit adjustment spread. So the question is, how do we derive this credit adjustment spread? And how can we discuss? Well, we have two things. We have two ways how we can come to this credit adjustment spread. First, what Stefan explained in the previous slide, we can use the historical median, which is the ISDA transition spread and is used in the ISDA fallback protocol, and where we see that the market converges to. And the other approach is the so-called forward approach, where we derive the spread or the credit adjustment spread from basis swaps and the basis which are currently on which it is currently traded. And if we compare these two approaches, we thought about certain measures how to find out if this is a fair client treatment or not. First is traceability and transparency for the client. So we always have to keep in mind we are talking about clients here. This can be either retail clients or corporates, but you have to find a way to make that as easy to understand and as transparent as possible. So one can say that the historical median is probably the easiest to understand. So in terms of traceability, this is definitely recommended, and especially if you talk about retail clients. Because if you look at the forward approach, the client must understand what a basis swap is and why a basis swap gives you this difference. This might be true for corporate clients, but I think if we come to the typical private person, this might be much more difficult than just saying, well, there has always been a difference between this rate and that rate, and we just took the historical median, or we just looked how this difference evolved over the time, and now we use this. And in terms of transparency, the question is usually, well, you cannot simply tell your client, oh, well, we use the ISDA transition spread, and this is 10 basis points. The client usually wants to see the source. And this is then much easier in the historical median, because this is simply published from Bloomberg, and not only in a Bloomberg terminal where you need access, but simply on their homepage. So you can just look it up, and it's published there daily, and when it's fixed, you will probably see it in a very prominent way, but you can just well, more or less Google it and find it on the Bloomberg homepage. Whereas when you derive something from a traded or indicative quote, how can a client find that, especially if you want to check it afterwards? So this might again be quite easy for a quite professional corporate client, but usually a private person and a private client or a retail client won't have that abilities. So overall, if you look at how easy it is to explain, then the ISDA fallback spread, the historical median, is definitely easier to explain to your client. And the other important thing is, what is a fair treatment? Well, if it's value or economic, or well, first economically neutral, but what does this mean? Well, we would say it is neutral if the value is neutral. So not only the rate at a given point in time or the rate at the cessation date, but the value of all the coming cash flows over the life cycle of the product. And then, is this true for these both approaches? Well, it is definitely true for the forward approach, because this is how it is defined. So at the time when you change the contract, if at the same time you check what the forward approach would be, or what the forward approach is, then you are by definition neutral. Yeah, because this is how the difference is currently traded. So no further questions needed. So this is quite simple on the forward approach. On the historical median, Stefan already showed us on the slide before how to see this, because if you look at it now, then you see that the basis is still there. So Or there's still an additional basis, and the basis is not only the ISDA spread, but we also see that the market converges to this, the basis converges to the ISDA spread. So what happens is that if you adapt the historical median as your credit adjustment spread at the cessation date or close to the cessation date, I think we don't have to talk about a couple of days, or close to the CCP transition date, then you are fine, because as we said, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Everyone will have to deal on that spread, and this is definitely the fair value, and you won't see a difference in the two approaches. So if you are close to the cessation date and the closer you get, the smaller will the difference between these two approaches be. It is different if you try to change your contract, well, now or in the next couple of weeks or quite early in this year, because then you will see that the ISDA spread and the basis swap approach are still different. So our go-to would be, if you change your contract, perhaps now, but the change will be effective by the end of this year. So the effective date of your change will be the cessation date. Then you are value neutral in the ISDA spread, and you can easily use it. So the procedure would be, you talk with your client, you give him an offer, you change the contract with your client legally, so the contract is adapted, but the change will only be affected beginning with the cessation date, which is quite similar to the ISDA fallback procedure. Then you are quite safe. You have a very easily traceable, a very transparent approach, which you can adapt for all clients, for all contracts, and all clients are treated similarly, and you are fine. If, however, you have certain contracts you wish, or your client wishes to change beforehand and also wishes to already adapt and become effective before the cessation date, and not only a couple of days, but say in the next couple of days or weeks, we should use the forward approach.
Perfect. Thanks, Sabine. Maybe with the time in mind, we got a lot of questions. We jump to the next slide. And so once the transition approach is defined, which trades have to be transitioned then? Sabine, maybe you can take that question as well.
Yes. Well, all which have a certain relation to the LIBOR rate. And if you screen your portfolio, the important thing is that you will find LIBOR probably not only as a direct reference rate, but in you have various sources of LIBOR. So interest payments, but perhaps also embedded derivatives, in your covenants, default interest. So please make sure that you really find all relevant sources. And the second thing I would like to mention here is that this inventory should give you a full overview on your client's business, and in the end on the affected processes. But when we're talking about client business here, I think it's important to say that you have to have a complete overview on your client's business. So for example, if you found a loan, you have to check, are there any joint derivatives which are directly linked, or if you have sterling loans, do you also have US dollar loans? And do you have to talk about all of them in one time and not address the client in various sessions? So a complete inventory is essential for everything, for your entire transition. So make sure you found all possible relations between clients and various products, and make sure you found all possible sources of LIBOR.
All right. Then coming to the last slide, talking about milestones. Can you give us some ideas besides this LIBOR inventory you mentioned? What are the most important steps you should take in your LIBOR project with regard to the transitioning of client business?
Yes, let me start off, and perhaps Stefan can add some thoughts on that as well. I think first is the technical readiness, which is not only the inventory, but you just have to be able to handle risk-free rate products. So have this implemented, because, well, if you have not done that, you cannot make any offers. So be technically ready as soon as possible, because all the other questions in regards of communication with your client, your own preparations, what does this mean in your additional or in your downstream processes, what does this mean for your daily business, they still have to be addressed and handled. So the earlier you are ready technically, the more you can focus on the real important, or the important things from a business side. Stefan, what do you say?
Yeah, from my point of view, that is clearly true, and the IT readiness is a very important point, but hopefully most of the banks are prepared from an IT perspective, or are just working on how workarounds could be implemented in fully IT readiness, and not to handle and not think about how to handle these products. I think that step should be completed, hopefully, in all of the IBOR projects out there. And the most important aspect this year will be, as we've seen in the timeline before, the client communication, and for sure the transition strategy. So you have to be sure how you want to address your client and how the offerings to change the existing LIBOR contracts should look like. And you have to be sure that all person talking to your clients and everybody involved in that process is prepared for that. And as we've seen before, the complexity of the mechanisms behind that is really high, and you have to be sure that everybody who is involved has understand what it means to change one contract from one to the other, that the client is has in any point in time a good advice, and you're treating your customer fairly.
Perfect. Thanks, Sabine. Thanks, Stefan. Then I would like to jump to the Q&A session. Reminding you that you cannot ask questions verbally, so if you have any question, please post them by clicking on the Q&A icon on your screen. So let me jump to the posted questions. And the first one is, when do you think a cessation announcement will be made? Stefan, do you want to take the question?
Yes, happy to do that. I think that question is the holy grail in the LIBOR transition. So I think everybody in the market has an idea about that, or its own idea about that. If you ask me, and if I have to give you a clear answer, then from my view, I would expect it to come in the second half of February. So we are very close before I would expect, but perhaps we will see it later that it might be March. But I think not definitely, but there are a lot of signs which shows us that we will be in Q1, and I would say in February.
Okay, and Sabine, is there a new market standard for RFR loans?
Well, that's a good question. Depends on how you define a standard. I think we saw certain, well, we have the recommendations of the working groups, and we already saw quite a couple of different loans which were already made based on these conventions. So of course we see a lot of backward looking. We see usually an observation shift. We see that things like a payment delay is usually restricted to the derivatives and not so much in the loan market, which is mainly, which is often a technical issue. So I think one can say there is a certain standard in syndicated loans, in corporate loans. There is a certain standard, yes, a certain degree of standardization, but I think we are not yet there where all loans look the same. And I think we're still finding the real pros and cons of different variations. I think not so much the complete basis, but the certain variations within the overall conventions.
And two questions which are intertwined. Maybe Stefan, you can take them both. The first one is, when should I start the communication to my clients? And the second is, do you think the clients are ready for the transition?
Also good questions. Perhaps I start with the second one. Do you think clients are ready for the transition? I hope they are, but I don't really believe that all of the clients are ready for the transition. Sure, the bigger ones are, I think, definitely ready for the transition, but especially the smaller clients, retail and SMEs, maybe are not ready for the transition from an intellectual or from a communication part, and also from an IT part and the process part. And that brings me to the second question. When should I start the communication? If we keep that in mind, that there might be a lot of clients outside there which aren't prepared for that, what is coming, then it is very important that you start engaging with your clients as early as possible, and you have to talk to your clients so that they know what is coming there at for example, for Sterling during that year, and that they can prepare themselves if not yet happened, and that on the other hand we have the recommendation Sabine mentioned for the client outreach, which should also happen from working group perspective in that quarter. And if you have a multi-stage approach, and the first stage should happen as early as possible, and you have to educate your clients as early as possible.
Great. So I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Sabine, what would you recommend, an active transition or to rely on fallbacks?
My mute button does not like me today. Sorry for that.
No problem at all.
Well, I usually, in everything, prefer a more active approach. So first thing is, do you really have fallbacks in place? And the second is, well, usually if you do something in a more active way, you have more control over it and you can easier influence it. So I would say, yes, the more active approach. However, depending on the size of your portfolio, you might not be able to address everything actively. So perhaps it's a good idea to use your inventory and to highlight where you can use a fallback because you have a sound and easy fallback already in place, and highlight the most critical engagements where you definitely have to address that in a very active manner.
All right, maybe a last question. Do you expect new swap definitions to develop that will perfectly match the loan conventions, different types of look back? I think he's referring to in arrear, in advance, the different methods, or will derivatives liquidity stay with current ISDA OIS definitions conventions?
So if I took the question, for me, I would expect that there won't be any bifurcation of the derivatives market. So I would expect clearly to have one liquid, standardized OAS style, ISDA OAS style market, which is very liquid. And then you will have the client business that, from my point of view, has to look like the loans which these derivatives are cash flow hedges for. And that means that from my perspective, you are faced to the challenge that your hedging instruments does not 100% look like a deal on the client side, and you have to manage that at the risk in your treasury department. For example, the gap of the look back in a client derivative and the OIS style swap with a very small gap, if there is one gap. But from my perspective, it's not a big issue. So the products available, the OAS swap style derivatives, you can use them also to manage the interest rate risks of the other client specific and in some way structured derivatives.
All right, so we have a lot of unanswered questions due to that we are short of time. So I would like to encourage you to reach out to us if we haven't answered your question, or if you have any further questions you haven't posted, please reach out to us at any time. We're looking forward to discuss every aspect on the IBOR transition with you. And if we can jump to the next and last slide. Thanks. If you would like to be kept up to date on all upcoming topics and stay in touch with us, please do so via the here shown channels. So you can you can contact us using the different options here. And on our website, IBOR-reform.com, you can find former CAP Talk recordings on the IBOR transition. So 2 p.m. sharp, that's it for today. We watch out for our next CAP Talk issue. Thanks for your interest. Stay safe and enjoy the weekend. Goodbye.